Hi, this is Shilpa here. Welcome to this particular live session where I'm going to talk about how to solve complex multi-layered cases. So, I've been having the survey where people have been asking me questions on different types of issues they face when they are in a clinical situation. And one really common question was how to solve multi-layered, multi-miasmatic cases in a clinical situation. So, I have some questions written out here, and one of them was about how do you resolve complicated, challenging cases? There's one which says, how do you set follow-up prescriptions in a complex chronic case? How do you start in a complex multi-layered case? And then how do I narrow them down? How do I address them? So these were like the major issues people have been asking me about. So let me first come to this main important process of understanding what exactly is a complex case. Now, so let me give you, and this is something I've learned through time, through experience, into how this particular scenario where a complex case is formed. And one important thing is you have to realize that we are all born with a core state. We are all born with some inherited susceptibilities, with some, diastasis, latent miasm or inherited fundamental miasm, and we have this tendency to have certain types of chronic issues. We have a susceptibility to develop certain types of chronic issues. This is what I call the core state, and this is what we are all born with innately, right? But over time, as we move along through life, we get some acquired states. So acquired states could be superimposed on this core state. So I've actually got some things to show you and some things to draw for you because I need you to understand this really well. So say, for example, this is your core state. So if you can see this, all right? And what actually happens is through time, you develop all these different types of, so this is another state which has developed on top of that. This is another state which could have developed through time. And I'll tell you how these develop, but be with me here. I just wanted to show you how these states superimpose on top of the core state. And as we move along, it forms the sort of, and imagine each one of them to be a thread, and each one of them is enmeshed and entangled within each other, and together they form the state, and slowly the core state is submerged under these states. Now, what causes these states to superimpose? So most of these, layers or superimposed states could be due to acquired infections. So if you realize the Hahnemannian miasmatic theory is all about a particular type of infection that leaves a taint and creates a set of issues, and that's the miasmatic issue, and that's related or that's caused by an infective agent. But infection is just one cause. There could be acquired states due to, say, for example, some sort of an acute situation. Say, somebody's exposed to acute stress or acute shock or acute grief, or it could be due to some physical exertion. So any sort of state which leaves a taint for a long time, or say, for example, it could be due to some sort of suppressant, say, exposure to some toxic chemicals or exposure to heavy metal poisoning, or it could be some sort of drugs that people, conventional medications that person has been on, say some sort of hormonal suppressants, or it could be steroids for a very, very long time, or it could be some sort of, or antibiotic abuse. Any form of abuse of any long-term medication can create a state by itself. So all these different states that created through time, form this sort of complex cases, and it's an individual susceptibility what state embeds and leads that. So what the body is trying to do is trying to resolve this sort of, and remove and bounce back. But if it's not able to bounce back, then what you have is this sort of a complex enmeshed, and then through time they could be formed as you go and as new layers and new states, and they, each one with own group of diseases and conditions, and each one will have one specific causative factor as a part of that. So what's actually happening here is through time you have this complex ball of, if you have to imagine, say, a Play-Doh at the end of child's play where you have multicolored. So this is three-dimensional, right? And imagine they are all in relation to one another. And we have one big ball of Play-Doh, which is different colors, and you cannot find one color separated from the other. And the core is embedded really down deep there, which you cannot see. So this is basically what for me is a complex case. So I won't really call them concentric circles. They are not concentric circles like an onion, which many of us learn, and you just peel them off. It's not as easy. It's something where you have to be able to understand what is the presenting state and then peel them off. So I'll tell you what are the different types of strategies which I have seen in my practice and my students when I'm training them through my mentoring programs and through my courses. How do you really work? So there are three different types of strategies when it comes to working with complex cases. And I'll tell you what those strategies are. So the first one is what I call a startup strategy. Okay, so a startup strategy is something where a person is presenting at stage 1 and 2. And when I say at stage 1 and 2 is when what you see are diagnostic symptoms, what you see are just symptoms based, really basic common symptoms of a disease process. If you see those stages, or if you see those sort of conditions, then you have to use what I call a startup strategy. And I'll come to that in a minute. The second strategy is what I call, which you are all familiar with, is the classical strategy. Okay, so classical strategy is where you have a person who is now at stage 3. And the stage 3 is where you can now find some mind-body connections, you can find some peculiars, some generals, and you can go a bit deeper. So this is where you use approaches which are the classical approaches like the Hahnemannian approach or the Kentian approach or the Bonninghausen approach with the generalization, the grand generalization. These are the classical approaches. And then comes something which I call the breakthrough strategy. So a breakthrough strategy is where you find deeper innate processes where you can actually work, you can find sensations which are beyond mind and body. And you can work with some peculiar keynotes where you can actually work at the level of those sensations and use approaches at that level and find a common theme which is running through multiple conditions within that state. So what actually happens in a complex case is you start using, most people present at stage 1 and 2. So you have to use something which I call a startup strategy. And then as time goes, as the unfolding happens, you might have to stack them up, which is what I call strategy stacking. So you could be using multiple startup strategies through time. Slowly the case unfolds, and then you can start using the classical strategies. And slowly, as the core gets exposed with these different types of, those threads and those circles start, moving away or peeling away, you can start using at the very core the breakthrough strategy. So you are basically unfolding those acquired layers, coming down to the core, and as you come to the core, you use those deeper and deeper approaches and help the patient unwind and unfold and get on their way to healing, where they can now bounce back and get on track with their healing and resolution. So this is basically a flowchart of how the strategies will stack. Now, it's never a linear process, like, you first use a strategy, which is startup, and then classical and breakthrough. No, you might have to start a few startup strategies, then comes your classical strategy, then you might see some blocks coming up, so you go back to another startup strategy, and then you go to and fro between them, and then somewhere down the track, you use a breakthrough strategy. But even while using a breakthrough strategy, there could be a place where you might have to again go back to a startup strategy. So if you see, this is how, as conditions progress, as things happen, you will have to use different strategies depending on how the unfolding happens. So now let me tell you what are the main mistakes that I see when people are using these strategies? One important mistake, and you must have realized by now, is that this is not about one remedy. So, it's quite interesting to know that people work and try and find a minimum. Kent has written about something where if it's a pathological case, most of these complex cases have a pathological issue in them, and there is a pathological block, which means there is an organ which is damaged, and you will have to. This is another block which is something you'll have to work on. So if you have a remedy which covers all these states and all these at the core, and then you also cover the pathology, you will be able to resolve a case with one remedy. It is highly impossible. If not completely, it's like there's 0.1% chance of you resolving such complex cases with just one remedy. So if you realize we have all these different layers and all these different threads, if you're, or enmeshed, entangled pieces of colorful dough that you have to work on, and each piece has its own remedy. So what exactly happens in a startup in such a case is you might have to start with a remedy. A startup approach is where you use a remedy that covers one state, which is the most presenting state, and you not just cover the symptoms of the state, you also cover the causative factor which has created that state. So say, for example, the most superficial state has been a person comes with some sort of an infection, not been resolving, and then you realize that he's taken tons and tons of antibiotics and it's not resolving still, and then you have some sort of a chronic non-healing wound that he comes with. So in that case, the first block here would be the antibiotic, which has been there for such a long time. This is what we call a not been well since syndrome. So what actually happens in such cases is you not just take the symptoms of that non-healing wound, you also consider the causative factor. In this case, it is abuse of antibiotics. Together, you are finding a remedy that covers this state. And this is the second mistake people make, is when they're using remedies, to peel off a state, they only use remedies which work on the symptom. Well, you will have to use a remedy which works not just on the symptoms, but also on the causative factor, which is what has exactly caused that state to appear. Was it a hormonal block? Was it an antibiotic block? Was it an infective block? Was it an organ damage that's created a block? And you use targeted remedies for that block as well as the indication. And hence, the startup strategy most frequently has two remedies in it. One remedy is where you use it on the indications, and the other remedy is used what we call as a blockbuster. So a blockbuster is a remedy which is, it could be an antimiasmatic, because most commonly the block is a miasm, right? So it could be something which is a nose root, or it could be some sort of a tautopathic, which is where you use a remedy made from the the drug or the conventional medication which has created that block, that is tautopathic, which is an isopathic sort of a remedy. It could be a hormonal remedy. It could be an organ remedy because an organ is damaged. So you first need to repair an organ and then you move on and then work on the symptoms as well. So, or you could have, say, somebody has not been well since suppressed skin infection, and then you realize that they have applied a lot of corticosteroid ointments on it. So you have two blocks here. One is the suppression of the skin and never been well since that infection, so you have an infective agent there. And secondly, the corticosteroid ointment, which might have created another block there. And the third would be the infection, the skin lesion itself. So there are so many different things you need to consider when you're peeling off that state. Once you peel off one state, the condition unfolds and a new layer or the new state exposes itself. And when that second state is exposed, you start treating that. So what the important thing here you have to realize is this is not a quick fix. And the reason it is not a quick fix is because every time you clear a state, you are clearing up the indications and the causative factor together. You are using an antimiasmatic plus an indicated medicine together. And that is the reason it is not a quick fix because you are peeling off the entire layers rather than suppressing and just looking at the superficial picture there. And as you start moving one layer after the other, you can find that the patient starts unfolding and those blockages start releasing and things start exteriorizing in the direction of cure, in the direction of the healing process. And slowly you realize that he's no longer the patient, he or she is no longer at stage 1 and 2. There are no longer blocks which are coming in the way. You start seeing the core symptoms, the core picture much better. And now is the time, once those startup strategies have done its work, you start looking at the constitutional and the core picture. You start looking at the inherited miasmatic picture and work with those core remedies, and deeper work starts happening. And this is a beautiful journey. It doesn't matter how long it takes. Every layer, every state you basically are, eliminating, the person is moving one step closer to health and healing. And this is the beauty of the process, is that no matter the patient stays with you for, until one layer is removed, or 3 layers are removed, you have given them great sense of well-being, and you have done a lot of good work in that time. So a complex case is something where you have to take it one step at a time. Don't complicate things, and don't start looking at one remedy that pierces through all layers. Just simplify things. Just look at what is the topmost thing I have here. And once you know what's the topmost thing, just focus on that. Look at the causative factor, and the symptom pattern, peel that layer off, and then we'll think of the second layer. And, that is exactly what you just take those baby steps, just take one step at a time, and that's how you start peeling. Now, the third very important question people keep on asking about complex multi-layered cases is, what potencies do I use? So let me tell you what other potencies I have seen. We use a spectrum of different scales of potencies, but the main important potency, which most of these patients, because they have been, they come to you with years and years of suppressions, years and years of infections, and issues and states, and burdened with things, and so many complex problems that have complicated their state, the susceptibility is very low. So in most of these cases, when I'm looking at an indicated medicine, especially using startup strategies, when you're using at the superficial layers, I use LMs, because LMs have those deeper yet gentle actions which we need for such patients. But for the blockbusters, there are two different types of scales which I've seen work very well. One is the centesimal scale, and in that you use the octaves, the Kenton octaves, and within that we start with the 30C first, and then we move on to the 200 and the 1M, and then we use the 30C in a triple split dose. By a triple split dose, I mean you use one remedy and you use one dose and give it in a time difference of about 12 hours or 24 hours, and you use 3 different dosings within that 12 hour, say after every 12 hours. So you take one dose now, one dose after 12 hours, and the third dose after 12 hours. This is a typical pattern. This is like a triple split dose. So 3 doses in one go. This is 1 unit, right? And the idea is for the dose to register. If the dose registers, then we wait and watch, right? So that is the second point. The whole idea in a triple split dose is to keep dosing until the dose registers, so maximum of 3 doses, and you could have a time difference of about 12 hours or 24 hours, depending on how the patient is. And once you have that, you wait until you can see whether the person is responding to it. You see some response, you see some sort of symptom pattern changing. We wait, let the unfolding resolve, and then you redose. And then you get the best out of that dose or that potency every time you redose. So this is the whole idea of using a triple split dose, especially for blockbusters. Now, the other way you can work, is still using the centesimal scale, but in this case, you can use the Fibonacci series. And the Fibonacci series is very interesting because it uses the Fibonacci series of potencies. And you use the same way, but in this case, you give one dose and then you move on through and go through the entire series. And the beauty of the Fibonacci series for me is that you are using, generally I start with the octaves, and then I see a remedy is doing really good work and I know I want to use the full spectrum of this remedy. I then switch over to the Fibonacci series and then get the full spectrum of the remedy. So these are the two different types of scales I use, especially when I'm using working with complex, complicated cases. So just to recap, I use LMs for indicated remedies, and I use the octaves or the Fibonacci series in the centesimal scale for the blockbuster remedies. So now the question is, how do you do it in real life? How does it really work? Because every case is so different, every complex case is so different, and each one needs a different type of strategy, and each one needs a different type of stacking of strategies. So, if you've not yet downloaded, you have to get my book, Next Stage, because in that book, I have given you, about 6 or 7 different types of cases from my students' practices, which have been followed up for more than 2 or 3 years, on how we have stacked these strategies and worked with these complex cases and changed those remedies and made those prescriptions, and how we look at each layer and how we determine what remedy comes when, at what time, and what comes next. So this is something which is, if you haven't got that book, please do get that book, if you can. And the other thing, I'll be posting a link of that book down below this video once we are over. So check that out. And the other thing that I really want you, to talk about is, if you're in my course, Pathway to Success in Homeopathic Practice, it's a free course. It's going on at the moment. And in the second lesson, I'll be talking about how these different types of strategies work and what it involves. And I'm going to show you case studies of each of the strategy in action. So, lots to come, but hope this gives you, a general broad spectrum outline of how this works in practice and how these complex cases actually get formed and what you need to do in order to work through it. But if you keep it simple, if you just focus on one state at one time, it is something which is much more simpler than working with a very, taking a 2-hour case and trying to find the minimum or trying to find one core remedy in that one go. Then it's hard work, because that core remedy is not, it's so embedded deep down that it's not going to be able to penetrate and work. That's the first thing, if you do find the core remedy. And the second thing is, it's going to be blocked. It will not work, because there are so many different layers on top of that. You have to eliminate that before it can work. And the second thing that could happen is it could aggravate. So that is the reason why you don't want to be using core remedies at the start of a complex case. You want to be using remedies that basically peel off those, acquired states on the top, and then expose the core and then work at the core. That makes things so simple, and then it's just a matter of time that the case starts unfolding and you build that relationship and bond. And as the patient progresses, as you progress, it's an absolutely worthwhile and satisfying journey. So hope that helps and hope that made sense, because this is something which, working with complex and challenging cases has been something that's so close to my heart right since I was in my rural clinic in Nasik, where that was the first time I've experienced the block, and I experienced, I had to look beyond my favorite approaches to work with these cases. And today it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to work with those cases. It's a pleasure to give them an outcome where most conventional medicine cannot. And it's a pleasure to help my patients and my students get that outcome. So yeah, if you haven't, get the book, because that book will give you a lot of, wonderful cases and give you a great idea on how you can use it in your next patient. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know, if you have any questions or your comments more on these cases, but I'll love to answer them in my, in my subsequent calls. Thank you very, very much, and you take care.